Good afternoon. I think we have a couple of people from the other room joining us, but I'm just decided we need to start to keep the time. So the next presentation is by Dr. Jörn Erselius, Managing Director of Max Planck Innovation. I think it's just society, but it's innovations. I'll give you the word, and I think there will be subsequent discussion also quite interesting. I've heard some already topics or questions that people mentioned to me. So, thank you.
Okay. Maybe I just give you in the beginning a little bit background on my person, so you know how everything developed over the last years. So I'm a molecular biologist and did my PhD at the Max Planck Society, and right after I did my PhD, I actually moved into technology transfer to Max Planck Innovation, which at the time had a different name, but it was already the same company, and my plan was to be there for 2 years and get some experience and then move on to industry. But now this year I had my 31st year anniversary. So yeah, essentially all my professional life I spent in technology transfer. Gehen wir mal weiter. Ja. So some of the slides you will see are very similar to what you have seen before, but I also included a few slides which we usually show at our institutes, how the whole process works and so on, and that I thought that might also be interesting to talk a little bit about the practical aspects, how we actually do it at the different Max Planck institutes. But first, a little background on the Max Planck Society. As you heard already, Max Planck Society is completely dedicated to basic research, and which means that we do have industry collaborations. I will come to that, but for example, we don't do any contract research and so on, so really basic science. And the most important thing for the Max Planck Society is to produce high quality research results, and that's why Max Planck is also very proud of being for the last 10 years or even longer in the top 3 of research organizations on a worldwide basis when it comes to highly cited publications and so on. We also have more than 20,000 employees and a budget as the others of, well, Helmholtz is a little bit larger, but of roughly 2 billion. And most of the money comes from state or federal money. 50% comes from the federal government, 50% comes from the state government. That's why also all our institutes are scattered all over Germany, and we have institutes in all states. And we run 86 different institutes, about 30 in natural sciences, which means chemical, physical, technical sciences. Then we have about 30 institutes in the life science areas, but we also have social sciences and humanities with about 20 institutes. Already Max Planck said knowledge must precede application, and that's why Max Planck already decided quite early to get active in technology transfer. That this can work even as a basic research organization, you can see in a few examples. One is already very old. That was already in the 50s when the Ziegler-Natter patents were filed, and it was a method to produce polyethylene. So that brought license income to the institutes of more than 500 million euros. Then I joined Max Planck Innovation in 1991, and in 1992 we could actually license the technology, the so-called flash technology, to all the big companies who two magnetic resonance imaging machines, and the technology essentially speeded up the whole imaging process by 10 to 100-fold. That's why immediately the technology was running on all machines. It was a little bit difficult because we had the patents, but nobody wanted to take a license. So at the time, for the first time in our history, we sued companies like Siemens and General Electric, and so the big ones, and they were really surprised that they got sued by German research organization. But in the end, it was quite tough, but in the end we were successful. And then in the end, 99% of all the companies in the field took a license, and it earned us about 150 million of income after we spent about maybe 2 million on the lawsuits. The most financially successful project at the moment is or was the cancer drug called Sutent, which originated also in a startup of the Max Planck Society, which was later several times bought. We always had to renegotiate the contracts, but in the end the drug came to the market, and the patent expired last year. But in total we received 160 million, and we had a other technology called RNA interference, which is here named Tuschl, from the inventor Tuschl, and that's probably our most successful startup company we ever had. It was not in Germany, but in the US. Meanwhile, they have 2,000 employees and a market capitalization, I think, of 20 billion. And our patents expired as well when the products came to the market, so we are not earning really a lot of money with it. But now, up to now, 4 drugs came to the market, and 5 more at least are in the pipeline. So from an impact view and for the patients, it's a very big success, of course, for the Max Planck Society to have produced a technology which really helps a lot of patients. So a little bit about the Max Planck Innovation itself. As you can see from the name, Max Planck Innovation GmbH, we are a separate company, but we are 100% owned by the Max Planck Society. We are also 100% financed by the Max Planck Society, so we don't have to pay ourselves from licensing income or whatever. But on the other hand, all money we receive in return, we return to the Max Planck Society. So we are the central unit for patenting and licensing, and also for spin-off support, and we more or less work exclusively for the Max Planck Society. And 2 years ago, we had our 50th birthday. So I think after Fraunhofer, we were probably the oldest technology transfer office in Germany, and started with building instrumentation and so on, and switched then in the late 70s more to commercializing patents, not producing, selling anything ourselves anymore. And essentially that's started the technology transfer as we do it now by patenting inventions, licensing them. In the early 90s, startup support became part of our technology transfer efforts. And as I said, all the income we generate is passed through to the Max Planck Society, and there it is distributed between the general administration, which gets about 1/3, and 1/3 goes to the institutes, or a little bit more than 1/3, from which the inventions originated, and 30% of the income, of the gross income, goes to the inventors as inventors' remuneration. Next one. So, as we heard before, of course, there are many routes how technology and knowledge transfer works. So it's the same that we, of course, many people who are educated at Max Planck, they move on to industry and so on. So by the minds move into industry, of course, also by publication. There are more than 15,000 publications Max Planck has every year. We have usually between 8 and 10,000 PhD students, junior scientists, postdocs, and so on. And then, of course, we have the classical technology transfer where we are responsible for, which deals with patenting, licensing, and startups. So we are quite interdisciplinary team. Meanwhile, we are far more than 30 professionals, which many of whom have also an industry background, or many have a science background. And we have biologists, chemists, physicists, lawyers, business people, and most of them also stay for quite a long time with our company, so we have little fluctuation, and that's why we have more than 400 years of expertise and in technology transfer. So how does it usually, what actually we do? On the one hand, it's one of our biggest tasks actually is to sensitize our scientists for the whole theme of technology transfer, that they think about commercialization and so on. And this is not really an easy task because, of course, most of the people who come to Max Planck and want to do basic science, they are not really first thinking about application, but rather about science. But so we give seminars at the institutes and try to educate them and sensitize them for the whole topic. So if we get interesting technology, then we do decide together with the institute. We do some patent searches, market searches, and so on, and then we decide whether we should file, for example, for patent applications. We are not really responsible for industry collaboration, so it's really licensing and startups, but we support the Max Planck Society if they do industry collaborations, especially on the intellectual property side. But what might be as interested, and I already mentioned, is that we have industry collaborations, but we do them only if there's a common scientific interest in it. Usually both partners pay their own expenses, though the income which comes from industry is only between 10 and 20 million euros per year, so very little. And as I also said, we are not doing any contract research. We have a number, if we feel that the technology is too early to license, which often is the case, we also have some instruments for translational research to validate the technology, and I will get to this a little bit later. And then, of course, if it comes to commercialization, we have essentially two different routes. We license the technology to existing partners, to industry, and which means we offer it to industry. We negotiate the license agreements and also then later follow up the compliance with the agreements, or the second route is that our researchers want to found a startup company, and then we also coach them, help them. They can use our networks. We bring them in contact with investors and so on. But I will also come to it in a little bit more detail later. So after the last 50 years, we got roughly 5,000 inventions disclosures, so about 100 per year in average. We filed, let's say, half, on a little bit more than half, or 60-70% of it, we filed patent applications, and then we concluded already almost 3,000 licensing agreements with industry. What is important is that this is not only on a local basis. So, and there's also no real pressure actually to commercialize our technology. In Germany, the idea is always to find the best partner and where the chances are best that the product actually gets developed and comes to the market. So about 50% of our licenses are within Germany and the other 50% are on an international basis. And this earned us so far 530 million, so roughly 10 million every year in license income. And we have also actively supported 125 startups since the early 90s. In total, there are roughly 180, but where 125 got direct support from us, and we also take equity in the companies, and from the equity we take and which was either sold or in the merger and acquisition or during an IPO, we also learned almost 30 million from our equity stakes. When our last president came into his position, he said, well, for Germany, these numbers look quite good, but if we want to know whether this is also good on an international basis. So an international evaluation essentially was, he asked for an international evaluation. So we were evaluated by members of quite international successful technology transfer offices. So there was Cambridge University, there was Harvard, there was MIT, Weizmann Institute. You don't want to be compared with Weizmann because they make more than 300 million of income every year, but also members from industry. And now you have to believe me, they essentially came to the result that what we do is quite good. And that, of course, was nice that our president heard that we are competitive on also on an international basis. So now I would like to come a little bit more to the process, how we actually do things. So since we are centrally located in Munich and our institutes are all over Germany, I told you we have somehow to sensitize them for the topic, but if they then have an idea and think they have something valuable or something which might get patented, we ask them to call us, and that's usually the first contact they have, a phone call to us. We discuss it to them over the phone, and if we believe that it's something interesting, we ask them to send a written invention disclosure, and then we do further searches. But what is important, in the end, we don't decide whether a patent gets filed or something like this, but we only give a recommendation to the Max Planck Institutes, and the final decision is with them. And if it's good, we claim the invention and a patent is filed. Sometimes it's too early. We tell them, well, you need this and this and this experiment. They might do it, they might not. Or we say, well, this is not really worth filing or commercializing, and then we release the invention to the inventors. And this should just show a little bit the process. So first we do this evaluation and look at the market and everything, as I said, and then we make the decision together with the institute. Why is the final decision with the institute? In the beginning, they have to pay the patent costs, so we cannot, as a separate tech transfer company, make a decision for them whether they should spend money on it, and then we encourage them to do some more experiments in the first year after the patent is filed before they do the so-called PCT application. What is also important, that 95% of our filings of patents are actually directly with the European Patent Office and also in English language, so that if we want to market it later, we don't have to translate anything, and we're ready for for international activities. Then at some point it gets expensive if you have to try to decide whether you do national filings, and that's when also the financing of the patent application is changing, because up to including the PCT application, the Max Planck institutes have to pay the costs, and if it goes national and the costs get higher and higher, the Max Planck Society has a central budget to promote patents. And this is something which has only changed a couple of years ago. And when we realized that we often had to drop patents which were promising because the institutes could not really anymore pay the high patent costs. There were departments which had like 3-4 patents filed at once, and then it came to the national filings, and that would have meant 100,000, 120,000 euros of patent costs within 1 year. And even at Max Planck, which is well financed, this was a little bit too much. So there was a change in financing the patent applications. We didn't want to finance it completely centrally, because it has also some regulation effect in the beginning, that not everything gets filed just because the scientists decide so. So they have to pay a little bit, but when it's expensive, they get support. And then this is just very quickly. Of course, we do not only commercialize patents, but we have also a lot of technology which is not patented, which is on the basis of know-how. It can be cell lines, it can be antibodies, maybe some software programs and so on, where we also, of course, commercialize these technologies without any patenting. As I said, we have a number of programs to also validate technology when it's still too early. Internally, we don't have too much money for it. We have a small technology transfer fund, which is about 1 million per year, but usually we have between 5 and 10 projects per year which get funded. Out of this, it can be 50,000 euros, it can also be 200,000 euros, and they can get the money only if they have a recommendation by the technology transfer office or by us. Otherwise, it's not possible to apply for these funds. We are especially active in the healthcare area, and we founded an early drug discovery center in 2008, when we realized that nobody would anymore license our technology in the healthcare field anymore if it has not a certain standard. And then we founded this early drug discovery center, and the Max Planck supported this for the first 10 years with 6 million, but not the institute itself. It was always on a project by project basis, so people had to apply for projects, and then they would get the financing, and further development was then at the lead discovery center. And then there are mentioned a few of the additional government programs where we also help people to apply for money there. In the startup field, we have now a new startup support program. I will come to this later, which is called Maximize. We have also some money to support our startups with industry expertise, where we can get consultants and pay them for consulting our startup teams, similar to the Max Planck Technology Transfer Fund for the licensing technologies. We also have a pre-seed part, which is 500,000 per year, where one can also develop technology a little bit further, that they come to that they are ripe for a startup company. And we have in the IT field, we have an IT incubator at the Max Planck Institute in Saarbrücken, together with the University of Saarbrücken, where also some money is provided to further develop the technologies. And as I said, one of the most important tools for us is the LEAD Discovery Center, and it was founded now almost 15 years ago. There are now 100 employees, and really try to bridge the gap from the early research result to something which is called a LEAD compound, which means it's a compound which was proven in animal models and is a good basis for developing later a drug. And at that point, usually the pharmaceutical and biotech industry is interested in taking up these ideas. And this was so far very successful. We have a number of industry deals. I don't know exactly, but 4, 5, or 6 compounds are now already in clinical trials. And a few years ago, the LTC was also able to raise an own fund together with EIF, similar to what Fraunhofer did, and also very similar to the I&I Bio Fund, which you have here in Prague. And on the one hand, we of course try to license out this lead compound to industry, but lately we also more and more move these projects into startup companies, and that's why this fund is also so important. Nevertheless, despite all this focus on startups, it's obviously important that we license. The licensing business is still our most important business, and it's important to have a good network. We still believe that technology transfer, despite all digitalization, is a people's business. So we visit a lot of conferences, trade fairs, and so on. And a big thing for us is really to expand our networks to industry, to investors, and so on. And usually we have for all the technology transfer offer that we publish this on our homepage, which doesn't help a lot because, I mean, most of the companies are not really looking there, but it's usually a 2-page description of the technology which we use then for marketing. And we also allow all our people really to keep up to date with scientific and things, so that they always are a good partner for our inventors to discuss the inventions with. Then what is very important is that we are very flexible when it comes to licensing. I mean, all technology fields are different, and you always have to find the right terms for the right technology. It's completely different, of course, in healthcare, where we usually have an upfront payment and then milestone payments according to clinical phases and so on, and then of course royalties in the end. In other fields we don't have any milestones, but usually a license consists of an upfront payment, some minimal annual royalties in some cases, but then milestones, royalties, and we always ask the partner to cover the patent costs. And we try to be, we try to give favorable terms for our startups. So, and also what is important, if we commercialize a technology and our inventors who want to found their own startups, we support this. So even if we have the feeling a license to an established company might be financially the better solution, we will always support the startup. And we had always big discussions with our scientists, of course, on equity. How much do they get? How much do we get? And so on. And that made things like sometimes a little bit difficult. And a couple of years we decided to essentially to go to a flat rate. So we usually take 10% of equity in the company before financing. So that means that Max Planck has 10% and the founders have 90% before financing. In return, for our equity, we don't ask for any upfront payments. We also not ask for patent reimbursement. And when it comes, but we also always alongside with it goes also a license agreement, but there we also try to have very moderate terms. And especially in the startup fields, I think it's a general trend, not only in Germany or within Max Planck, Germany and Europe, that it becomes more and more important that your technology transfer does impact, and it's not anymore so much about get the highest financial return out of it. It's really to show that that jobs are created, companies are there, that products come to the market and so on, and the financial return is not anymore that important. Of course, this comes quite handy for us because our two most successful patents expired last year. Then I would like to come in the last part of my presentation to the supporting startup companies. As we mentioned before, not only like in other countries, there is a high political pressure on the academic institutions in Germany to produce more startups. And to be honest, within the Max Planck Society, we don't have really a big entrepreneurial spirit among our scientists. So it's always difficult to identify projects and identify people who really want to start a company. And so that's why but also in this negotiations with the funding agencies, I said that we actually promised to do more for startup, and that's why we started last year an initiative which is called Maxpreneurs. And essentially this has 3 columns, and one is that the central administration, the Planck Academy. They do courses on entrepreneurship, on the one hand for directors, but also for younger students, postdocs, and PhD students. On the other hand, we have a foundation, the Max Planck Society, the Max Planck Foundation, and 2 or 3 years they helped us with employing a few people who are also scouting at our Max Planck Institutes for new startup companies and give them some early advice. And then we, of course, have the efforts at Max Planck Innovation, where we support startups and lately, started the startup support program, which is called Maximize. So it's important, of course, in the beginning to identify startup projects, and that's done by all people at Max Planck, by the patenting licensing managers, by the startup managers, and as I said, also by the scouts from the Max Planck Society. If there is something which is interesting, we first try to secure some IP, and then if we decide that it's really should become a startup, then we essentially have again 2 routes, and one is that they directly go for the startup. We help them writing business plan and finding financing and so on. But the route is more or less directly to the startup. And the other one is if these are very early technologies, that we then try to channel them into our new incubation program, Maximize, which is very similar, which you will see this in a minute, to the AHEAD program Thomas already described, because that runs, as I see it, quite successfully, and the Max Planck Society decided that we do not have to reinvent the wheel, and we did send some of our teams to the AHEAD program, and then we did build up something similar. But first come to the first route, direct to the startup. We have a dedicated team of of 6 people who essentially support them, the startups from the business side, from the financing side, and so on. Support they do on the technological side. They so far got mainly from our patent and licensing managers. But this is also changing a little bit, and I will let you know in why. Because, as I said, we, on the one hand, we support our scientists in the startup, and on the other hand, we have to negotiate the license and the equity with them. And there are some people, not necessarily me, which think that this is a conflict of interest and that these two parts should be separated, that the ones who negotiate the license and the equity should be different people from the ones who actually support the startups. So this will be a little bit more divided in the past. So all the negotiating will be done by our patent and licensing managers, and all the support will be done by our startup managers. And as I said in the very beginning, we are discussing the whole idea with our founders or potential founders. We do market analysis together with them. We try to bring them in contact with industry experts who can challenge them a little bit on their technology and the products they are planning. And in the end is the decision whether we actually go for a startup. Then we negotiate to make sure that they have access to the technology, negotiate the license and equity agreement, of course, help them in attracting funding, and also have helped them to negotiate all the contracts with potential investors. If the company is founded, we still support them. We are often part of the board of the companies. We manage all the shareholdings, the equities, so we can, to a limited amount, similar to Fraunhofer, also participate in additional financing routes, so that our equity does not get diluted too much. And then we, of course, are also involved in later if the company is sold, for example, or does an IPO, which rarely is the case, and we help negotiate all the agreements in connection with IPO or merger and acquisition. And they are the most important parts from the Max Planck Society, is that usually the buyer wants some guarantees and warranties on the technology and so on, and which, of course, the Max Planck Society cannot give. And the only thing we guarantee is that we own the IP. And this is often a very difficult point in negotiations. But if the projects are a little bit more early, then I said that we have this new program which is called Maximize, and it's very similar to AHEAD. And we just over the last year, we employed 6 people to set up the program. And actually it just started quite successfully last week, where we had our first run. And you know this slide already from Thomas. So there's first a boot camp where we have a stress test on the idea. They get in contact with some industry experts. We discuss everything with them. In the end, they should be ready with the so-called pitch deck and be ready to apply for the phase 1, where they can further sharpen their business idea. And if this is successful, they later on in the phase 2 can also get some substantial support to further validate and develop the technology. And we want to do this twice a year. And now in the first one, we had 19 teams which applied for the bootcamp, and 13 we accepted for the applied for the bootcamp. 13 actually then participated in the bootcamp, and 10 of them now applied for phase 1. And we will see how successful this will be in the future, but we hope that we will be able to bring the number of startups really a little bit up. In the past, there have been usually between 5 and 10 startups per year out of the Max Planck Society, so not a too large number, but on the other hand, of most of them really with venture capital financing, sometimes quite large rounds of financing in the very beginning, often in the US. We had just had a startup which raised $50 million in the first round, and so on. And in total, I think our startups where we have equity in for the last 2 years always raised between 80 and 100 million of capital. So I think that's the number is quite low, but the companies are usually quite successful. And mentioning that we have these large financing rounds in the US, I think it's also important that it's often a little bit of a conflict for us. Where shall we found the company? Of course, I mean, we want to have startups in Germany, but in Germany, the financing situation is, of course, much worse than it's in the US, and then we often have the dilemma. We might get a financing round in Germany of 5 million, and we can get a financing round of 30 or 40 million in the US, and then where do we start the company? And usually then we decide to do it there where we think the chances are best that the product is developed, and that's why we also have a number of startups actually in the US. And so far there are about 180 startups, and despite the ones who were bought in a merger or acquisition, I think still 75% of all the companies we ever founded still exist. And 7 were actually listed at the stock exchange. None lately, I think the last was in 2008. But that was this company, Nylon, which I told you, which has now 4 trucks on the market. And in total, our companies attracted more than 4 billion in public and venture capital financing, and which again I think proves that even if the number of companies which are coming out of Max Planck is quite low, we believe the quality is quite high. Okay, and that's actually, with these numbers, I would like to close and open for questions.
Thank you, Jörn. I have one question at the beginning, if I can steal the floor. You mentioned that you in your organization, you focus mainly on licenses and startups and spin-offs, but also the industrial cooperation is handled by the Max Planck Society. I assume, the question is basically, I assume that there is a quite a large portion of this activity happening. I'm not sure how much you know about it, but just to reconfirm that this is still part of the overall transfer, technology transfer, if you talk about that, this is still part of it for Max Planck.
Well, the collaboration agreements are usually negotiated directly between the Max Planck Institute or the department and the companies. And my personal opinion is that we should also be responsible for this, but for historical and whatever reasons, it never came to this, and the same is true, for example, for consultancy agreements. This is directly negotiated with the scientists and has to be approved by the institute. We usually have to have a look at the IP clauses in there, but we are also not in charge of the consultancy agreements, and it's also nothing Max Planck Society really markets. I mean, that, for example, in the UK, many of the universities have departments where they actually offer consultancy to to industry, and this is nothing Max Planck does.
Thank you. Thank you. It's clear. Thank you.
Okay. Impressive numbers. Congratulations.
Thank you.
My question is, what is the success rate of the accepted inventions and the inventions which reach the market?
Well, which reach the market, I don't know. Of course, the number probably is very, very low. What I can
Especially
say
if you
is
work
that
in the drug development.
from the technologies we take on, so we mainly as patents and so on, but also to commercialize that know-how and so on, it's about 25% of the technologies we take on, we are able to license to industry or startups or whatever. And the percentage where we actually license the technologies to our own startups is increasing. And that seems to me be a number which is quite normal. I have talked to many institutions also in the US, and if you look at MIT or Stanford and so on, it looks like what you can achieve is 25, maybe 30%, and the other technologies you are not able to commercialize. And especially if it comes to basic science, I don't often, we cannot really see in the beginning whether this is will become a success or won't be a success.
Still great number. May I have one more question? You have mentioned the invention disclosure on one of your slides. Is it obligatory for the employees of the Max Planck? And what about the publications? Do you have a mechanism to check if the publication prior to be sending to the for the publication includes something what can be accepted as an invention?
Yeah. Well, we have no chance to look. So we don't screen publications which come out of the Max Planck Society. I mean, you saw the number, 15,000 every year. It would not be possible for us to screen them. So we really depend on the scientists that they actually, contact us when they think they have something. We once did an analysis on patent databases and so on, and must say that we have the feeling that if it was a really important invention, we haven't missed it so far. So we were lucky, or the system somehow works.
I have already introduced myself, so I'll proceed to my question. We are an engineering institute, and this year, for the first time, we decided to go to a fair. So next week, we're visiting Hannover Messe. And you mentioned proactive marketing, and you mentioned fairs. Is my understanding correct that you visit those fairs as well? And if so, how do you make your presence? What form? In what form are you present at such events?
We are actually more present as a passive visitor. So we rarely have. I mean, we had this before, that we had also a booth at some of the trade fairs, but it's more for us, for our patent and licensing managers and startup managers and so on, to go there and talk to the companies which are present there and build the network. But it has not proven, for us at least, very successful to actually exhibit technologies there. But that might also be the reason, because our technologies are usually too early, and most of the people would just pass by and think, well, what is this? So
That's also our
I mean, we use it to build up our network and so on, and find. I mean, we have if we go, for example, we go to the Bio Europe or something like this, then we have a lot of technology offers with us, and we make meetings before, and we directly approach the companies and discuss technologies with them, but we don't have a booth there.
Thank you very much.
Any more questions? Okay, I can see a couple of hands.
Okay. Hello, my name is Hanush Marx. I'm from Technical University of Pilsen now, but I've been dealing a bit with the system of research, applied research and evaluation in the Czech Republic before. And I was struck by you mentioning a lot of your projects actually could end up in the US, even from the German market, basically, it would end up in the US. And even before that, I would have had a question whether, what is the key, what do you think, and whether you actually ever were engaged in any kind of analysis comparing the legal context of technological transfer in Germany and US, because you showed the key institutions globally which are very successful. I happen to know some of them, let's say Weizmann is super successful. And I think it has to do a bit with the legal context as well, and also with the fact that they directly aim at the US market. So is it about the size of the market? Is it about the companies which are basically leading the technological trends in the given sector, which seems to be sometimes the case? Or do you think are there any key legal limits, basically continental limits or the European limits? I think there are, which make the situation in Europe different from the US.
Well, I wouldn't say in our case that the legal things are really so different. I would say that US firms often are not so risk adverse as the German companies, and they are more open to actually invest in early technologies than many of the German companies. And that, I think, is the main reason. If it then comes to negotiating the license and so on, everything is very similar. One difference is, of course, whether you have in your license agreement in German law, which we prefer, or whether you have US law, because but of course then if it later comes to problems like litigation and so on, then it's much more favorable for us to be in Germany than in the US. And if it comes to startups, it's mainly that the financing and also management expertise and so on is much greater in the US. So our first company, or the one company I mentioned, this Nylon, there was in the German newspaper Handelsblatt a couple of years ago an article, and they wrote about this company, and they had done some research on it, and they showed that this company alone, that was before now COVID and BioNTech and so on, but had raised more money than all biotech companies in Germany within 10 years together. So one company, and that shows that a development like this just wouldn't have been possible in Germany, and still I think it was the right decision then to start a company in the US.
Okay, thank you. Because if it applies to Germany, then it applies to Czech Republic. Thank you.
Yeah.
So thank you. My name is Michal Belský. I'm from the Technology Transfer Office of Czech Academy of Sciences. And maybe we could discuss this in more detail tomorrow on the internal session with the technology transfer staff of Czech Academy of Sciences. But if you could give us a short answer on, or a short description maybe on the Institute of Virtual Equity, which you described in your slide, and maybe your personal opinion on it compared to, I think, Fraunhofer, you haven't been mentioning virtual equity there, so that might be a difference between Max Planck.
Yeah, so virtual equity or phantom shares or whatever. I mean, this is a big discussion at the moment in Germany, whether there are some concepts from politicians and from Sprint and so on, where they say we should transfer our IP in return for 5% virtual shares and no license agreement attached to it and so on. So obviously we don't like this idea. And Usually we take virtual shares actually if it comes to the US or other countries where we have startups, because we have to spend a lot of money on the legal framework, because we are not so familiar with US law, so we always have to employ a US lawyer and have to spend 50,000, 100,000 euros on legal fees, and that's where we usually then take this phantom stock or virtual shares. And it has the advantage that if there are further financing rounds, you are not involved. I mean, if you have an open participation, you always have to go through all the documents in financing rounds and so on, and see that everything is in compliance with your regulations. On the other hand, you have less information rights. It's more difficult to invest in a further round. You get faster diluted and so on. So it has its advantages and disadvantages, but it comes to Germany, we don't want to take virtual shares. We want to be part of the founding team. Yeah.
I think there were two questions in the back.
Hello, my name is Mikuláš Vargic. I'm a lawyer, and among other clients, I work for INI Bio too, which you mentioned. And I have a question about the conflict of interest, because it's quite interesting topic. You mentioned that there is one team negotiating on behalf of the Max Planck on the license side and the other on the startup side, which makes sense. And do you have the same approach when Khan comes and is investing in the same startup?
Well, first of all, this division of the two, dividing the negotiations from the support is actually just coming now. So in the past, we believed that it's one of our advantages in the whole startup process, that we could actually also consult the team on the technical aspects and so on, which was usually done by our patent and licensing managers. And we were always very transparent to the teams that, we help you, but you must be aware that at some point you have to take a license, and we will have to negotiate the terms. And especially since when we moved to this flat rate of 10% and so on, all the discussions became more and more easy. But then, we also did a survey, and it's with European technology transfer offices, and it seems to be about 50-50. In 50% of the offices, the two things are separated, also for conflict of interest, and in the others, it's not separated. And if you separate it, I think one looks at conflicts of interest, it would also be important. For example, we just had, I just heard a talk from the tech transfer office in Switzerland, where they, for example, do not allow the founders themselves of the research organization actually to negotiate the license, because they feel that, of course, that there's a conflict of interest if an inventor has to negotiate against his employee. For example, we as patent and licensing managers, we don't have a personal interest. We try to negotiate on behalf of the Max Planck Society, but for the founders themselves, it's even more personal.
If I may have another question regarding the US startups. Do you just set up, let's say, a shelf company there and keep the operations in Germany, or is the entire operation switched to the US?
Usually the entire operation is there, and usually it's a management team from the US, and often not even any scientists from our side move to the company. It's just that we were in contact with an investor, and he said, well, what kind of a great technology, we have money, we would like to build a company here in the US, what do you think? And then we also don't apply the 10% equity rule. I mean, there we renegotiate on a case-by-case basis, because our inventors are not really involved, or better but have an advantage if we get, of course, a higher percentage in the companies.
I thought there was one more question. Yeah, in the back.
Hello, my name is Peter Marshik from the Biology Center, and I would like to follow up the 10% of equity you mentioned. What is interesting for me to know, does it apply for the IP based on purely on the know-how? And it doesn't matter if it's Max Planck a shareholder in those companies or not? Is it the same?
Well, the 10% essentially apply for the IP-based or technology-based startup companies. It can be know-how, it can be patenting, but it includes some licensing of the IP. Of course, there could also be some, let's say, student startups or people who want to start a company which has nothing to do really with the technology of the Max Planck Society, and then we also, of course, wouldn't take any equity, but they would still get support, for example, through our new support program, but then we wouldn't take equity.
Any more questions? Okay, I think we will, oh, there's one more, maybe? Ernest? Or just Michael, okay, sorry, Michael, I didn't see that.
It's been already partially answered. In 2019, I was sitting on a coffee with Anthony Hyman, and he was just about to start DuPont Therapeutics.
That was a company which got 50 million in the first round.
Yes, that's what I'm gonna, actually, I believe he said it was, I was just checking now, somewhere like that. Now I found it's actually 60 million euros, the first round, the A. And now, after 3 years, they have already acquired almost $300 million.
Yep.
And at that time, but it was partially answered. At that time, he was discussing whether or not to leave Max Planck, whether or not to have the company in Germany or US, and whether or not to accept the 60 million euros because it was coming from China. And that's what he told me, maybe. So the question is there some ethical concept as well regarding the money from China? And the second is, from what I know from colleagues from Max Planck, they are actually put in front of the decision, either you stay at Max Planck and do your lab work, or you leave and do company work. So does it still apply, and is it for everybody, or RDV? Because he actually stays at Max Planck, but at the same time he's a scientific founder. It's like VIP position, or so maybe 3 questions.
Well, it's still true that you are not allowed to hold 2 positions. So you cannot, for example, be the CEO or CSO of a company and at the same hand be director at the Max Planck Institute. So if you have an official position in the company, you would have to leave. I'm not aware of any Max Planck director who ever left to move into the company. So usually they have a consultancy agreement. They are also allowed to have a collaboration agreement with their own let's say their own startup, and there's obviously, we have a close look that there's no conflict of interest, but it's possible, which is different from many institutions in the US. For example, at the MIT, you are not allowed to have a collaboration agreement with your own company, but usually this still has to be separated. And well, at that, I mean, it was a wild idea Tony Hyman had, and nobody knew whether it would work or would not work. And I don't think that you would have gotten €1 in Germany for this. So that's just that venture capitalists are much more risk adverse and in Germany. So the only way was to do it in the US, and whether then money comes through the back door by China or something like this, I don't think we actually analyze this. And we also have a startup in China, but usually, I mean, if of course we had the choice, we would rather found in Germany, but if it looks like it's the only way to develop the technology, then well, we are opportunistic.
I will follow up on that one just to, because I recently had a discussion about some basically state interests or for some sensitive technologies that may be preventing actually from, allowing them to go to some, areas where they feel sensitive. Are you exposed to some of these restrictions or not at all?
Well, we are. So all our license agreements are subject to export control and so on. So if we do a license with a Chinese company, or in the past I think we have 3 license agreements with Russian companies. You would need to get the approval. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask about you showed the really big team supporting your office.
Yeah.
And I understand there's a whole set of people with a separate expertise.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that any kind of qualified decision-making about applied research has to be sector-based. There's no general rules, actually, because each market is very different and there's a different conditions. And do you rely on your team, because you also said you have 400 years of experience, and you're able to raise the competence and skills and qualifications from within the team mostly, or do you also need some external data support, consulting, and based on the sector, what is just generally speaking, what is the management perception of you?
So most of the expertise, I think, is internal. And then we obviously do, if you want to evaluate it at technology transfer or at the value of some technology, we never do anything like net present value calculations or something like this. This is not possible for basic science research, but we do a lot of benchmarking. And so we look at similar deals from us or from other institutions. And as I said, we have a very good network to almost all European and also US technology transfer offices, and we would call them and have you dealt with them, what kind of terms, of course usually it's confidential, but in which ballpark is this and so on. That's how, but we do not usually hire official agencies or something like this for help. So essentially we try to do everything in-house except the patent applications where we work with outside patent attorneys, but all the other things we try to do in-house. And if it comes to litigation, then we need outside lawyers.